Let me ask you a troubling question. Why have we failed to solve the problem of climate change? Climate change is the environmental issue of our time. The Earth has warmed to record levels. We are experiencing increasingly intense heat waves, droughts, and wildfires. And we are suffering extremely damaging rises in sea levels, extreme weather events, and coastal flooding. The problem of climate change is particularly vexing because we know what causes climate change and we know what policies would address it. The unprecedented levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are largely responsible for climate change. And so we know that enacting policies that would make it more expensive to emit carbon would address climate change. Rachel Kite, who was at the time the Vice President of Sustainability at the World Bank, said that the most powerful move that a government can make in the fight against climate change is to put a price on carbon. So, we know what causes climate change, we know what policies would address climate change, so why has the United States failed to enact climate policy? The most common explanation is that the US has failed to enact climate policy because most Republicans are skeptical of climate change. According to this logic, Republican politicians are opposed to enacting climate policy because those politicians believe that most of the Republican voters who elect them don't believe that climate change is real. This explanation turns out to be wrong. A few years ago, I became interested in understanding the psychological barriers to solving the problem of climate change. In my lab at the University of Colorado, we study the relationship between political identity, emotion, judgment, and decision-making. We conduct psychological experiments so that we can understand how the mind works, and then we use that understanding to help people make better choices. We wanted to understand the social psychological reasons underlying the political polarization of climate policy within the United States. We partnered with David Sherman and Phil Arrett, who are at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and we conducted a national survey of about 1,000 Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. And we asked them how much they agreed that climate change is real, that humans have caused climate change, and that climate change poses a threat to humans. Based on these responses, we measured the degree to which they believed in climate change, and we classified them as climate change believers or as climate change skeptics. Now, among the Democrats in our sample, they believed in climate change quite strongly, and in fact, there were very few Democrats on the skeptical side of the scale. Similarly, most independents believed in climate change, although not as strongly as Democrats. There were very few independents on the skeptical side of the scale. Well, now what about Republicans? Well, it turns out that most of the Republicans believed in climate change. Now, clearly, the Republicans do not believe in climate change as strongly as Democrats believe in climate change. But among the Republicans in our sample, climate change believers outnumbered skeptics by a factor of about 3 to 1. So this prevailing explanation that we have not enacted climate policy because the Republicans don't believe in climate change doesn't really stand up to the facts. But if most people believe in climate change, why haven't we been able to muster bipartisan support for climate policy in the United States? My colleagues and I suggest that the problem lies in the way our political minds work, and that our political minds don't really work the way we want them to. The problem is not that Republicans are skeptical of climate change. The problem is that Republicans are skeptical of Democrats. But wait. If we lived in an alternative reality in which Republicans proposed climate policy, the Democrats would be just as skeptical of those policies as the Republicans are skeptical of the Democratic policies. The political polarization of climate change reflects a trick that the mind plays on itself. When Democrats and Republicans respond to climate policy, they only think that they are evaluating the specific content of the policy. What they're actually reacting to is the political party who proposes the policy. In the words of social psychologist Jeffrey Cohen, people place party over policy. As a result, the Republicans often oppose climate policy simply because the Democratic politicians are usually the ones who propose that policy. And if we lived in this imaginary world where the Republicans had proposed climate policy, the Democrats would support those policies less than they currently do. To see how this works, let me walk you through the details of our experiment. In our experiment, we asked people to read about one of two climate policies that had been proposed in Congress. Some people read about a cap and trade policy. They read that if enacted, this policy would place an overall cap on carbon emissions. Companies would be awarded allowances to emit carbon. If they didn't use those allowances, they could be traded on an open marketplace. This creates an additional economic, market-based incentive for the companies to reduce their carbon emissions. Other participants in the study read about a revenue-neutral carbon tax. They read that if enacted, this policy would place a tax on carbon emissions. That increased tax would be offset by reductions in other taxes, such as capital gains and energy subsidies. So this policy would increase the price of carbon while holding constant the overall tax collected by the federal government. Now, in the real world, Democrats are far more likely to propose climate policy than Republicans are. But because my colleagues and I are experimental psychologists, we are not so constrained by the real world. We can create alternative realities to which we randomly assign people in order to understand how their minds really work. In this experiment, we randomly assigned people to one of two political realities. We told some people that Democratic politicians had proposed the policy that they just read about, and we told other people that Republican politicians had proposed the policy that they just read about. We then asked people how much they personally supported the policy. Among the Democrats in our sample, they supported the policy significantly more when they believed that Democratic politicians had proposed a policy than when they believed that Republican politicians had proposed a policy. The independents in our sample, who have no particular allegiance to either party, were unaffected by which political party they believed proposed the policy. Well, now what about Republicans? Republicans were essentially the reverse of Democrats. Republicans supported the climate policy significantly more when they believed that Republican politicians had proposed the policy than when they believed that the Democratic politicians had proposed the policy. The Democrats and Republicans clearly had polarized reactions to the climate policy. But the degree, if not the direction, of that polarization depended on which political party they believed had proposed that policy. Now, we also asked people to put their attitudes into action. We asked people if they would send an email to their congressional representative, urging their representative to support the policy they had read about. Again, the Democrats and Republicans towed the party line. Among the Democrats in our sample, they were significantly more likely to say they would send an email to their representative when they believed that the Democratic politicians had proposed a policy than they were when they believed that the Republican politicians had proposed a policy. Republicans, likewise, were significantly more likely to say they would send an email to their congressional representative when they believed that Republicans had proposed a policy than when they believed that Democrats had proposed a policy. These findings go a long way toward explaining the political polarization of climate policy. Even though most people believe that climate change is real, the degree to which they support climate policy depends largely on which political party they think proposed that policy. Now, some might argue that this is a perfectly rational and reasonable way to go about evaluating policies. Climate policy is complicated, so it might make sense for people to trust their elected officials rather than to dive into the policy content themselves. If I'm a Democrat, it would make sense that I would trust Democratic politicians and be skeptical of Republican politicians. But when people behave in this way, placing party over policy, they do so in violation of their own personal beliefs about what it means to be a good citizen. We asked people in our experiment to reflect on what it means for them personally to be a good citizen. We asked them how much good citizens should evaluate policies based on the specific policy content, and how much good citizens should evaluate policies based on political partisan considerations. People overwhelmingly believed that they should evaluate policies based on the policy content and not based on political partisan considerations. In other words, people believed that as good citizens, they should do exactly the opposite of what they just did. Now, what do these findings suggest about how we might be able to address the climate challenge? Several years ago, Andrew Revkin wrote a column in the New York Times titled "An Inconvenient Mind." He said that a large part of the climate challenge is not out there in the world, but it's inside the human mind. Revkin referred to what was, at the time, widespread skepticism about climate change. But such skepticism has abated. Most people recognize the reality of climate change. But the climate challenge still lies inside the human mind. If we want to solve the problem of climate change, we need to help people become the good citizens they want to be and to overcome the political polarization of climate policy. Thank you.